America's economy looks like a skyscraper built on unstable sand, solid from afar, but cracking underneath. By 2026, warning signs are flashing. State reserves are shrinking, debt is rising, and housing markets are faltering. Industries from manufacturing to tourism are disappearing. Tens of thousands lose jobs, and families struggle under heavy bills and debt. This isn't a typical slowdown. It's a quiet unraveling of the American dream. Some states won't just bend under pressure, they could break. Here are the 10 most vulnerable states, and the decline may have already begun. Number 10, Kentucky. Kentucky, known for its rolling green hills, rich bourbon heritage, and unmistakable bluegrass charm, may seem calm on the surface, but economically it's inching closer to a steep drop-off. Beneath that welcoming southern character sits a troubling reality that's hard to ignore. The state's emergency savings, often called the Rainy Day Fund, can currently cover only about 7.6% of its yearly expenses. Financial experts generally say a stable reserve should be at least 15%, ideally even higher. What that means in practical terms is simple but unsettling. Just one difficult economic quarter could force the state to slash critical public services almost overnight. The job market is already showing signs of strain. Kentucky's unemployment rate has climbed to around 5.6%, noticeably higher than the national average. At the same time, nearly 1 out of every 5 Kentuckians is living below the poverty line. And that statistic isn't just abstract data. It represents real families who are skipping doctor visits, postponing rent payments, or standing in the kitchen deciding whether the next paycheck should go toward the electric bill or a week's worth of groceries. Housing, which once represented stability and pride for many residents, is also starting to wobble. The median home price sits near $213,000, but in places like Louisville and throughout the rural eastern regions of the state, property values have begun sliding at a worrying pace. As prices fall, thousands of homeowners face the risk of owing more on their mortgages than their homes are actually worth. A scenario that echoes the painful housing crash of 2008. Kentucky's broader economy also relies heavily on a few vulnerable pillars: manufacturing, coal production, and agriculture. Unfortunately, those industries are often the first to take a hit when the national economy slows. Evidence of that stress is already appearing. Coal-related tax revenue has dropped by about 22% compared to last year, and the state's overall GDP declined by roughly 0.7% in early 2025, a sign of how exposed Kentucky is when demand for energy and factory output weakens. Put all of that together: shrinking financial reserves, a contracting economy, and households already stretched thin, and it becomes clear that Kentucky may not be prepared for the shock of a major downturn. If the next economic wave crashes ashore, the state simply doesn't have much of a financial cushion to absorb the impact. And if trends continue the way they are now, the drop could arrive far sooner and far harder than many people expect. Number 9, Rhode Island. Rhode Island might hold the title of America's smallest state, but when it comes to recession vulnerability, it carries one of the heaviest risks in the entire country. This narrow strip of New England coastline may look picturesque, yet financially it's running dangerously low on fuel. The state's emergency reserve, its so-called Rainy Day Fund, can cover only about 6.9% of yearly spending, a level economists say is well below what's considered safe. If a national recession were to hit hard, Rhode Island could find its budget stretched so thin that funds might dry up in a matter of weeks. Signs of stress are already appearing in the labor market. Over the past year alone, unemployment has surged from 3.6% to roughly 5.4%, a sharp increase in such a short time. Layoffs are beginning to ripple through healthcare and tourism, the two sectors that form the backbone of the state's economy. At first glance, Rhode Island might appear relatively prosperous. The median household income is around $74,000, which sounds comfortable on paper. But the housing market reveals a much harsher reality. The average home price has climbed to about $446,000, nearly 6 times the typical annual income. That gap is squeezing the middle class from both sides. Meanwhile, personal debt has swelled to more than $41,000 per resident, and missed payments on loans and credit cards are rising quickly. For many households, a single missed paycheck could push their finances into crisis. The warning signs aren't hidden anymore. They're becoming increasingly visible. Families are leaning on credit cards just to keep up with rent. Small businesses are starting to default on loans. Tourism revenue is slipping as travelers opt for cheaper beach destinations along the coast. Even the systems designed to protect residents are under strain. The state's pension funds remain significantly underfunded. Healthcare costs continue to climb year after year, and long-term revenue forecasts are gradually shrinking. Rhode Island once built its identity on resilience, an economy powered by shipyards, seafood industries, and tight-knit coastal communities. But the economic tide appears to be shifting. With limited industry diversity and very little financial backup, this small state could find itself among the first to struggle if a major economic storm rolls in. Number 8. Idaho. For a long time, Idaho was held up as one of America's biggest post-pandemic success stories. People saw it as a peaceful escape from crowded cities, a place with fresh mountain air, lower costs of living, and a booming economy that seemed to promise endless opportunity. But the very growth that made Idaho famous is now turning into a potential economic trap. Since 2015, the state's population has surged by nearly 18%, putting enormous pressure on infrastructure, housing, and public services. Cities that once felt quiet and manageable are now struggling to keep up. Boise, which used to be known for its affordability and laid-back pace of life, is suddenly dealing with a housing crisis few residents ever expected. The numbers tell the story. The median home price has climbed to around $483,000, almost twice what it was just 5 years ago. During the pandemic housing frenzy, buyers rushed in and paid record prices, believing the market would only keep rising. Now, many of those same homeowners feel stuck. As interest rates increased and demand cooled, housing inventory jumped by about 28% compared to last year. Homes that once sparked bidding wars and sold within days are now sitting on the market for months. For some recent buyers, the equity they thought they had built has disappeared almost overnight. Idaho's broader economy also leans heavily on 3 major sectors: real estate, agriculture, and technology, industries that can all become vulnerable when a recession hits. Recently, layoffs have started spreading through the tech sector, affecting both local Boise startups and larger regional offices. At the same time, construction projects that once symbolized growth are quietly being postponed or canceled. The state's financial safety net isn't particularly strong either. Idaho's Emergency Reserve Fund covers only about 6% of annual spending, placing it among the weaker rainy day reserves in the country. If state revenue suddenly drops, funding for essential services, like schools, transportation systems, and healthcare programs, could face immediate pressure. Households across the state are also beginning to feel the squeeze. The average family now carries more than $37,000 in debt, and over 20% of Idaho residents spend more than 30% of their income on housing alone. That leaves very little financial breathing room when costs rise or paychecks shrink. Not long ago, Idaho was celebrated as a shining example of post-pandemic prosperity, a booming destination where opportunity seemed limitless. Today, however, that boomtown glow is starting to fade. If economic conditions continue to tighten, the state could learn a hard lesson. Rapid growth can reverse just as quickly as it began, and the downturn might arrive faster and hit harder than many people ever imagined. Number 7. Arizona. Under Arizona's blazing desert sun, the state's economy is starting to feel the strain. For years, Arizona was one of the biggest migration hotspots in the United States, a destination that seemed to promise a fresh start. Retirees flocked there for the warm climate. Tech workers arrived for new opportunities, and thousands of people moved in from California hoping to escape the crushing cost of living. But by 2026, that massive wave of newcomers has started to create problems of its own. What once looked like a blessing for the state's growth is now becoming a serious burden on housing, infrastructure, and everyday affordability. Across Arizona, the median home price now sits around $424,000. In major cities like Phoenix and Scottsdale, the numbers are even more staggering, climbing well beyond $550,000 in many neighborhoods. Those prices are stretching households to their limits. with the median household income hovering near $72,000. A growing share of families simply can't keep up. In fact, nearly one-third of Arizona households are now considered cost-burdened, meaning they spend over 30% of their income just on housing. And housing isn't the only expense climbing faster than paychecks. The cost of groceries, utilities, and auto insurance has also been rising steadily, putting additional pressure on middle-class budgets that are already stretched thin. Arizona's financial safety net isn't particularly strong either. The state's rainy day fund currently covers only about 5.8% of its annual budget, leaving very little protection if a major economic shock hits. At the same time, some of the industries Arizona depends on most are beginning to wobble. Tourism and retail, which play a huge role in the state's service-based economy, have both slowed noticeably. In the Phoenix metro area alone, about 19,000 jobs disappeared within just a few months, pushing the statewide unemployment rate up to roughly 5.8%. The slowdown is also visible in construction. New building projects are declining, and several commercial developments have been paused halfway through construction. Meanwhile, Arizona's GDP slipped by nearly 0.9% in early 2025, hinting that the broader economy may already be losing momentum. Financial pressure is also building for everyday residents. Household debt is rising rapidly, credit card delinquencies are increasing, and foreclosures, something that had largely faded since the last housing crisis, are slowly beginning to reappear across the valley. Ironically, many of the newcomers who once powered Arizona's explosive growth are now the first to consider leaving. As the cost of living climbs and the housing market cools, the affordable desert dream that drew so many people in is starting to fade. Arizona once looked like a symbol of limitless expansion. But as the state faces rising costs and slowing growth, the mirage of endless prosperity is beginning to disappear. The Grand Canyon state may soon discover that beneath its sun-drenched promise lies an economy far more fragile than it once appeared, one that could start to crack if the pressure keeps building. Number 6. Nevada. Nevada's economy has always carried a bit of risk. After all, it's a state built on gambling. But right now, the economic odds don't seem to be in its favor. The entire system depends heavily on tourism, and when visitors slow down, the ripple effect spreads through nearly every corner of the state. That's exactly what began happening in early 2025, when revenue from gaming and hospitality dropped by about 13%, stripping billions of dollars from Nevada's economy in just a few months. The consequences showed up quickly. Hotel occupancy rates fell, major conventions were canceled or postponed, and sales tax revenues plunged, leaving the state with a noticeable financial shortfall. Even Las Vegas, the bright and glittering center of Nevada's economy, has started to lose some of its shine. Housing prices in the city have declined by roughly 8.7% compared to the previous year, while the number of homes on the market has jumped about 34%. As prices drop, nearly 1 out of every 5 homeowners now owes more on their mortgage than their house is actually worth. Drive through some suburban neighborhoods and the slowdown is hard to miss. Entire developments remain partially completed, with coming soon signs fading under the harsh desert sun, while unsold homes sit waiting for buyers who may never come. Nevada also has very little financial padding to soften a crisis. The state's rainy day fund covers only about 5% of its annual budget, making it the second lowest reserve in the country. When tourism struggles, Nevada doesn't just feel a mild slowdown. The economic engine that powers the state begins to stall completely. The job market is already showing signs of trouble. Unemployment has climbed to about 6.3%, and during just the first half of 2025, roughly 22,000 jobs disappeared, many of them in casinos, hotels, entertainment venues, and hospitality services. Meanwhile, household finances are becoming more fragile. The average Nevada household now carries around $45,000 in debt, and missed payments are becoming more common. Credit defaults have risen by about 3.5%, as workers who once relied on tips, commissions, and steady tourist traffic struggle to cover everyday expenses. Even cities that were once promoted as Nevada's next growth centers, places like Reno and Henderson, are beginning to lose momentum. Construction projects are slowing down, expansion in the tech sector has cooled, and retirees who invested their savings into newly built homes are watching property values slide. For decades, Nevada built its reputation on industries fueled by risk and volatility, gambling, tourism, and speculative growth. But volatility works in both directions. As visitor numbers shrink and investors pull back, the state's delicate economic balance starts to wobble. Out in the desert, fortunes can change overnight. Sometimes the jackpots hit, and sometimes they don't. This time, however, the dice seem to have landed cold, and for the moment, the house isn't paying out. Number 5. Indiana. For generations, Indiana has proudly referred to itself as the heart of America, a place known for reliability, hard work, and industries built on sweat, steel, and determination. But by 2026, that steady heartbeat is starting to weaken. The state's economy has always depended heavily on manufacturing, from automobiles and steel production to heavy equipment and massive logistics networks. Now, however, those same industries that once fueled prosperity are beginning to shed jobs at an alarming pace. Factory production across the state has fallen about 6.7% compared to last year, and Indiana's overall GDP dropped roughly 1.1% during the first quarter of 2025. The assembly lines that once symbolized the state's strength and productivity are gradually going quiet. The job market reflects that slowdown. Unemployment has risen to around 5.9%, with more than 40,000 jobs disappearing in just a few months. In Elkhart, a city long known as the RV capital of the world, layoffs have become almost routine. Over in Fort Wayne, large warehouses that once buzzed with activity now sit dark and half-empty. The constant hum of industry, Indiana's economic pulse, has slowed dramatically, fading from a roar into a faint echo. Financially, the state doesn't have a huge safety net either. Indiana's rainy day fund currently covers only about 6.4% of its annual spending, which would barely sustain the state through a short period of economic stress. Meanwhile, families across Indiana are feeling growing financial pressure. Household debt has climbed by roughly 12% since 2022, and evictions have increased by about 22% statewide. The housing market paints a similar picture of tightening finances. The median home price sits around $246,000, which might sound relatively affordable compared to other states. But with a median income of roughly $63,000, that affordability gap is widening quickly. For renters, the situation can be even tougher. Nearly one-third of renters are now spending more than they can comfortably afford on housing, stuck between wages that have barely moved and everyday costs that continue to climb. The slowdown in manufacturing also creates a deeper problem that goes beyond individual paychecks. It threatens entire communities. Many small towns across Indiana rely almost entirely on a single factory or manufacturing plant to support their local economy. When production slows or plants close, those towns face the possibility of severe decline. In places that were once lively and prosperous, main streets are increasingly dotted with boarded-up storefronts and for lease signs. Local shops disappear, foot traffic fades, and the sense of economic stability begins to erode. As the country inches closer to a potential recession, Indiana's vulnerabilities are becoming harder to ignore. The crossroads of America, a nickname that once symbolized opportunity and connection, could soon represent something very different. A point where aging industries, limited financial reserves, and growing economic pressure all collide. For decades, Indiana helped drive the nation's industrial growth. But in 2026, the state stands as a reminder of how quickly things can change. Even the most dependable heartland economy can falter when the steady rhythm of progress suddenly begins to slow. Number 4. South Carolina. South Carolina was once celebrated as the South's rising economic star, a place many believed was on track to become the region's next major success story. Over the past decade, it attracted waves of retirees, investors, and remote workers looking to escape the high costs of larger cities. On the surface, that migration seemed like a huge win for the Palmetto State. But along with growth came a growing imbalance that's now becoming impossible to ignore. Housing prices have surged dramatically. The median home price has climbed to about $388,000, representing an increase of more than 50% since 2019. Meanwhile, incomes haven't kept up. The median household income sits around $63,900, leaving many residents priced out of the very market that once drew people to the state for affordability. For families who believed South Carolina would offer financial breathing room, homeownership is quickly starting to feel out of reach. The strain is already showing in household budgets. Close to 30% of homeowners and nearly 40% of renters are now spending more than a third of their income on housing alone, leaving very little left for other essentials. Two industries that once powered the state's economic momentum, tourism and real estate, are also beginning to lose steam. In popular destinations like Charleston and Myrtle Beach, visitor spending has fallen by about 11%, while new housing construction has slowed significantly. In fact, housing starts have dropped roughly 18%, leaving scattered half-built developments standing as quiet reminders of a market that may have grown too quickly. The state's financial safety net is also limited. South Carolina's rainy day fund covers only around 6% of annual expenses, and essential public services like schools, healthcare systems, and infrastructure are already operating with tight budgets. Meanwhile, the job market is beginning to soften. Unemployment has risen to about 5.7% statewide, and roughly 38,000 jobs have disappeared this year alone. As hiring slows in both hospitality and construction, two major sources of employment, the middle class is finding it harder to stay financially stable. At the same time, household finances are deteriorating. Credit card delinquencies are increasing, personal debt levels are climbing, and the once popular promise of a lower-cost lifestyle is steadily fading. For years, South Carolina promoted itself as a place where low taxes, warm weather, and affordable living created an ideal quality of life. But by 2026, that vision is beginning to reveal a more complicated reality: fragile economic systems, rising debt, and an economy that depends heavily on industries that tend to shrink first when the national economy slows down. If the next recession hits with full force, South Carolina may not just experience a mild setback, it could face a much harder fall than many expect. Number 3. Mississippi. Mississippi, widely recognized as the poorest state in the United States, is already standing dangerously close to the edge, long before any major economic storm even arrives. Nearly 20% of its residents live below the poverty line, which is almost twice the national average. In simple terms, that means 1 out of every 5 people is struggling just to make ends meet in a state that was once proudly known as the hospitality state. The financial picture across Mississippi is deeply troubling. The median household income is only about $51,500, while the average household debt hovers near $38,000. When you put those numbers side by side, it's easy to see the problem. The math simply doesn't add up, and for many families, it never really has. Housing prices might appear reasonable at first glance. The median home price sits around $184,000, which looks affordable compared to other parts of the country. But for thousands of Mississippi families, even that level is still beyond reach. More than 1/3 of residents are considered cost-burdened by housing, meaning they spend a large portion of their income simply trying to keep a roof over their heads. At the same time, rising energy bills and increasing insurance costs are pushing many households even closer to financial collapse. And when things go wrong, there's very little protection to fall back on. Mississippi's rainy day fund covers only about 5.2% of its state budget, making it one of the smallest financial safety nets in the country. When revenue drops, the first areas to suffer are often healthcare programs and public education. The broader economy is already showing signs of contraction. In early 2025, Mississippi's GDP declined by roughly 1.2%, largely driven by downturns in agriculture, manufacturing, and healthcare, 3 of the state's biggest sources of employment. Job losses are increasing in cities like Jackson and Tupelo, as well as across the Mississippi Delta, where factory closures and farm layoffs are becoming more frequent. Entire communities that depend on a single employer are beginning to feel the pressure. Infrastructure problems are also becoming impossible to ignore. More than 1,000 bridges across the state are officially classified as structurally deficient, and water systems in places like Jackson remain locked in ongoing crisis. Meanwhile, rural hospitals that once served small towns across Mississippi are shutting down at an alarming pace. The state now ranks 49th in access to healthcare and last in the nation for education spending, highlighting years of systemic underinvestment. Altogether, it paints a picture of a fragile system that could spiral into financial chaos with just a small economic shock. If a nationwide recession arrives, Mississippi has almost no financial buffer, no strong backup plan, and very little room to absorb the impact. The danger here isn't necessarily a sudden collapse. It's something slower and more painful. For Mississippi, the decline would likely come as a gradual erosion of opportunity, unfolding one paycheck at a time, one struggling family after another, and one fading community after the next. And by the time the rest of the country officially calls it a recession, Mississippi may already be far deeper into the crisis than anyone realizes. Number 2. Colorado. Colorado, which once stood as a shining example of post-pandemic success, is beginning to show signs of strain. The centennial state built its prosperity on a mix of innovation, a steady influx of new residents, and that signature high-altitude optimism. But by 2026, pressures are mounting from every angle, threatening the very growth that once seemed unstoppable. Housing has become a serious challenge. In Denver, the median home price has soared to about $631,000, while statewide, prices average over $570,000, creating a serious affordability crisis for millions. Meanwhile, the median household income of roughly $84,000 hasn't kept pace with rising costs. As a result, more than 37% of homeowners are considered cost-burdened, and rents have jumped 28% in just the last 2 years, leaving many residents financially stretched. The economy beyond housing is also showing weakness. In early 2025, Colorado's GDP shrank by roughly 6%, and job losses are appearing across critical sectors, including technology, construction, and tourism. Statewide unemployment has risen to about 5.4%, with layoffs hitting Denver's tech corridor particularly hard. Ironically, the very industries that fueled Colorado's boom, real estate, outdoor recreation, and energy, are now contributing to its slowdown. Housing starts are faltering, oil prices remain unpredictable, and mountain towns that were once filled with remote workers are starting to hollow out. Household debt is climbing rapidly as well. The average family now carries nearly $49,000 in obligations, and credit card delinquencies have increased by about 3.1% since late 2024. The state's emergency reserves provide little relief. Colorado's rainy day fund covers just 5.9% of annual spending, offering minimal protection in the event of a major downturn. Social challenges are rising alongside economic strain. Homelessness has increased by roughly 21% statewide. Public services are stretched to their limits, and education spending ranks near the bottom nationally. Even cities long seen as affluent and resilient, like Boulder and Fort Collins, are now feeling the squeeze. Colorado's rapid growth, which once seemed unstoppable, has exposed the state's hidden fragility. Behind the scenic mountains and tech-driven promise lies a stark reality: widening inequality, over-leveraged households, and minimal fiscal protection. If the national economy falters, Colorado isn't likely to glide gently downward. Instead, it could plunge rapidly, with the effects reverberating from Denver's skyline to the smallest towns along the Front Range. Number 1. Louisiana. Louisiana, a state long defined by resilience and grit, is now confronting a crisis that sheer determination alone may not survive. It's no longer just struggling, it's unraveling. The numbers paint a stark picture of a system under pressure. The state's rainy day fund covers only about 4.3% of annual spending, the lowest in the nation. That means if tax revenues drop even slightly, Louisiana could run out of operating funds within weeks. The economic warning signs are already visible. In early 2025, the state's GDP fell roughly 1.4%, one of the sharpest declines in the country. The backbone of Louisiana's economy, oil and gas, is reeling from declining global demand and reduced offshore drilling. Tourism, the state's second major industry, is also faltering. Unemployment has climbed to 6.6%, with more than 54,000 jobs lost in just a few months. In New Orleans, the hospitality sector alone has shed 15% of its workforce, while Baton Rouge has paused or canceled over 60 major construction projects. Household finances are under pressure as well. The median household income is around $54,000, while the median home price hovers near $225,000. In rural parishes, incomes fall below $40,000, leaving many families squeezed between rising costs and stagnant wages. Poverty is pervasive, with nearly 23% of residents living below the poverty line, the second highest rate in the nation. Renters feel the pinch hardest. Over 40% are severely cost-burdened, spending more than half their income just to keep a roof over their heads. Debt levels are climbing. The average household owes about $42,000, with delinquencies increasing steadily. Insurance costs, especially flood coverage, have skyrocketed, while utility bills continue to climb. Louisiana's infrastructure is under constant threat. Bridges, levees, and water systems are deteriorating, yet funding to maintain them is shrinking. The state ranks near the bottom nationally in both healthcare and education funding. Hospitals are closing, schools remain underfunded, and the social safety net is fraying. If a national recession hits, Louisiana isn't just likely to stumble, it could implode. A sharp drop in energy prices or another major hurricane could push the state into full fiscal breakdown. The warning signs are everywhere, yet, like the levees before Katrina, no one knows how much longer they can hold. For Louisiana, the question isn't whether collapse is coming, it's how soon. Across the country, the cracks are widening. From Kentucky's struggling towns to Nevada's faltering casinos, from Colorado's tech corridors to Louisiana's sinking shores, the signals are impossible to ignore. This isn't just about rising home prices or state budgets. It's the unraveling of something far deeper, America's illusion of endless growth. For decades, the economy has relied on borrowed money, mounting debt, and blind optimism. But every system has a breaking point, and for many states, that point is already here. Household debt is at an all-time high. State reserves are dwindling, job markets are softening. Meanwhile, the cost of insurance, rent, and food is eroding whatever little savings remain. When the next downturn arrives, and it won't hit evenly. The hardest blows will land where resilience was never built, where industries depend on volatility, and where warning signs were ignored. Collapse often begins quietly. The factory that never reopens. The paycheck that barely stretches. The silent erosion of stability. This isn't the immediate end of the American dream, but it may be the reckoning it has long avoided. What's breaking now isn't just balance sheets or housing markets, it's belief itself. And when belief fades, recovery requires more than money. It takes courage, vision, and honesty about what went wrong and what might still be saved.